and tried to kill my wife. Who was that? Huh? Maybe it was one of your peoples.
I don't know yet.
You don't know?
No.
You don't know. I tell you what I know. Maybe I should just put 500 guns out there on the street and just start shooting up some people just to make a point.
Franco was a junkie, right? He was a rival. Some dumbass kid trying to make a name for himself.
Yeah?
Someone you forgot to pay off. Someone you slighted, without even realizing it. Could be someone you put out of business for being so successful. Look at you. Success. It's got enemies, right? Lots of enemies, so. Your success took a shot at you. What are you gonna do now? How are you gonna kill it? You gonna become unsuccessful? Frank, we can be successful and have enemies, right? We can be unsuccessful, too. You know, we can have friends. That's the choice we make.
The final evacuation of military and diplomatic...
From 1965 to 1972, heroin manufacturing and importation into the United States were dominated by a handful of French Corsican syndicates operating out of Marseille. According to the World Opium Survey, the most common factor in virtually every major trafficking group over the last 20 years, 1952 to 1972, is the preponderance of French Corsicans. This ethnic group, above all others, has controlled the heroin traffic in France. These Corsican syndicates converted morphine base into heroin in clandestine laboratories and supplied 80 to 90% of the heroin consumed in the US. They were often protected by French political figures until the early 1970s and worked closely with La Cosa Nostra, which handled US distribution. The primary distribution route sent heroin directly from Marseille to 5 major crime families in New York City, minimizing customs checks by passing through only once. Montreal remained a key transshipment point due to less stringent customs inspections between Canada and the US, and about 35% of heroin was routed through a Latin American network. The 1972 Turkish ban on opium cultivation crippled the French connection, and by 1975, heroin production in Marseille fell to its lowest level in 25 years. Marseille has been the stronghold of the Corsican criminal underworld, Union Corse, since the early 20th century. More influential than La Cosa Nostra in parts of Europe and Africa, Corsican groups were clannish and secretive, loosely organized into about 15 families. The Marseille Francisi group was believed to dominate heroin production and smuggling. In the 1930s, François Spirito and Paul Carbone pioneered Marseille's heroin trade by creating the city's first heroin lab using opium from the Nile Valley. During the 1950s, Union Corse was heavily involved in smuggling cigarettes and gold throughout Europe. The collapse of the Italian heroin connection in the late 1940s brought Corsicans deeper into the international drug trade. During the Algerian War, 1954 to 1962, President Charles de Gaulle reportedly enlisted Corsican gangsters as counter-terrorists against the OAS secret army organization. Some traffickers received protection from the mayor of Marseille, and French intelligence, SDECE and SAC, even formed units from Corsican gangs. Many traffickers continued heroin smuggling while working with the government. French enforcement efforts were notoriously weak. From 1950 to 1972, police discovered only 3 heroin labs in Marseille. Until 1969, the city's entire anti-drug force consisted of just 8 officers, and customs had only 12 investigators. Customs staffing in the Marseille area declined from 943, 1951, to 776, 1971. Legal restrictions hampered investigations, e.g., wiretap evidence was inadmissible, evidence from undercover buyers was excluded, and gambling income provided plausible cover for sudden wealth. The Corsican Code of Silence and France's cultural disdain for informants further obstructed law enforcement. Marseille was ideal for heroin production. Its 30,000 suburban villas offered discreet lab locations. With a population of over 1 million, including 600,000 Corsicans, it was a network of small neighborhoods where outsiders were quickly noticed. As France's largest seaport, Marseille was also its crime capital, with smuggling as the city's most common illegal activity. When morphine base reached Marseille, by land or sea, it was delivered by couriers to receivers, who passed it to buyers arranging conversion and export. Each participant knew as little as possible, ensuring secrecy and protecting higher-ups from exposure. Lab locations were frequently changed to evade detection. Most labs used portable equipment and worked around the clock to finish conversions quickly. The process could take 1 to 7 days, and chemists earned about $500 per kilogram. Joseph Monsieur Jo Cesari, one of the most renowned chemists, could convert 17 kilograms of morphine base into heroin per day. His lab was disguised as a normal home, with laundry hanging outside and children playing in the yard, to avoid suspicion. Cesari changed meeting spots constantly and only returned home at night to spot potential surveillance. He was arrested twice, once in 1964 after an 18-month police investigation, and again in 1972 after police traced a car used by his assistant. Albert Varane, a student of Cesari, ran a more advanced lab with automated mixers and dryers compared to Cesari's manual methods. While the Corsican underworld was only loosely federated, several groups dominated Marseille's heroin economy. A 1971 report by Congressman Morgan Murphy and Robert Steele named 4 core clans behind illegal production: Francisi, Venturi, Orsini, and Guerini. In practice, Venturi and Orsini operated under Marcel Francisi, and the Guerini group had largely faded by 1972. Identified by the McClellan Committee, 1964, as an organizer of morphine-based smuggling into France, Marcel Francisi emerged as the dominant figure in the French Corsican underworld and the top man in the heroin rackets. Born in Foggia, Corsica, 1919, he emigrated to France, earned the Croix de Guerre fighting with the Free French, then moved to Marseille, joining Joseph Ranucci's Corsican gang. Ranucci, second only to the Guerini in the early post-war underworld, ran prostitution, gambling, and bootleg liquor, but specialized in smuggling. When Italian police cracked down, Ranucci and Luciano shifted heroin trafficking from Italy to Marseille. Francisi handled the Beirut connection, establishing routes through Sami Khoury, Lebanon's chief smuggler. The Ranucci-Francisi group built an early edge in heroin that it maintained from the 1950s through 1972 over other Corsican outfits. After Ranucci's death in the mid-1950s, Francisi became undisputed boss, with Dominic Venturi and Joseph Orsini as top lieutenants. Orsini returned to Marseille. From 1965 to 1972, Francisi mostly lived in Paris, handling only the most sensitive matters, while Venturi ran day-to-day operations in Marseille, reportedly under political protection from Mayor Gaston Defferre. Francisi's brothers, Jean and René, acted as couriers. The story of Michael Victor Mertz weaves together French intelligence, Corsican syndicates, and US distribution. A World War II resistance hero and later a captain in SDECE, French External Intelligence, Mertz also infiltrated the OAS as an undercover agent and reportedly helped foil a plot to assassinate President Charles de Gaulle. At the same time, he ran a smuggling ring that moved over 1/3 of a ton of heroin annually, worth roughly $500 million over 8 years, as part of Joseph Orsini's Corsican organization. Background: born in the Moselle region, drafted into the German army, 1941. He deserted in 1943 to join the French resistance. After the war, he joined SDECE, 1947, and married Paula Scheller, adopted daughter of Charles Martel, a prominent Paris brothel owner. Partnership. By 1960, while still in SDECE, Mertz and Martel were smuggling heroin to the US. The main supplier was Achille Cecchini, Orsini's chief lieutenant, and close to Marcel Francisi and Dominic Venturi. Cecchini drew heroin from Orsini labs and handled US personnel, also Orsini men. Mertz planned logistics, recruited couriers, and split profits 50-50 with Cecchini. Methods. On March 11, 1961, Mertz sailed to New York on the Liberté, stowing 100 kilograms of heroin inside a Citroën's paneling. Later the same year, as an OAS infiltrator, he learned of a plot against de Gaulle, alerted superiors, Jacques Foccart and Alexandre Sanguinetti, and helped avert it, generating nationwide support for de Gaulle. He soon sent another 100 kilograms in a Citroën. US interface. Mertz or his aide Jacques Bousquet always came to New York to collect cash. By 1968, Mertz had shipped over 2 tons in total, with a street value exceeding $435 million, largely to La Cosa Nostra in New York. Exposure and arrests, December 1965. US authorities seized 309 pounds from Chief Warrant Officer William Condor, shipped as household goods from France by the US Army. The chain led to retired Major Samuel Desist, close to Nunzio Lucarotti, Orsini's nephew, Cecchini, and Frank Diaguardi, Miami LCN, brother of Brooklyn's Johnny Dio. The New York Times described the US end as important figures, but not the brains, attributing leadership to a Corsican ring supplying much of the Mafia's heroin. 1966. Cecchini arrested, released after 8 months with no trial. 1968. Bousquet and 5 Corsicans arrested. Bousquet claimed leadership. November 1969. Mertz arrested. In 1971, he and Cecchini were convicted and sentenced to 5 years. Most heroin destined for the US did not depart directly from Marseille. After lab conversion, couriers moved product to secondary departure points because any flight or vessel originating in Marseille drew close scrutiny from US customs. Routes constantly shifted in response to arrests and customs tactics. As one BNDD official put it, heroin moves like water. It follows the course of least resistance. Sometimes it gets dammed up, but eventually it will find a way of getting around whatever is blocking it. Air routes, 5 to 10 kilogram loads. Departures from major Western European hubs with direct links to New York, notably Amsterdam, Madrid, Lisbon, Paris, London, Rome. Loads travelled in false-bottom trunks, aircraft hides, or couriers' body rigs. Sea routes, larger loads. Departures from Le Havre, Cannes, Naples, Genoa, anywhere but Marseille, to New York, Miami, Montreal, and South America, 1965 to 1972. Montreal remained significant until 1972. The Cotroni clan controlled the city's heroin pipeline, shipping mainly to New York, but also to Toronto, Detroit, Vancouver, and Seattle. In 1972, 29 million people crossed into the US at 19 checkpoints in Vermont and New York, guarded by only 20 US customs officers at a time, making that corridor attractive. Over time, the Cotronis supplied independent Italians, Black and Latin groups, not just New York LCN. Even as the French connection dried up, 1973 to 1975, the Montreal connection remained a factor. A substantial share of French heroin transited South America on its way to the US. By 1972, roughly 35% of French-origin heroin reached the US via a Latin American network led by 2 Corsicans, Auguste Ricord and Lucien Sarti, linked to the Sicilian Mafia. Their routes fed Mexico, Miami, and New York. Origins. After World War II, Ricord and supplier Joseph Orsini fled France due to Nazi collaboration. Ricord arrived in Buenos Aires, December 1947. arrested there in 1957 for a continent-wide prostitution, white slavery ring, and expelled from Venezuela, 1963. He remained a pivotal trafficker. Sarti, a fugitive wanted for killing a Belgian policeman, arrived in 1966, eventually taking over daily operations. He sought expansion with Sicilian Tommaso Buscetta. Supply. Ricord bought heroin from Marseille, including from the Francisi cartel and Swiss suppliers. Couriers used European safehouses, Spain, Italy, Germany, France, and body concealment devices designed by Ricord. U.S. footprint. Despite BNDD having only one agent in South America for years, U.S. agencies arrested 21 couriers in 1967 and mapped Ricord's role. By 1970, Ricord had shifted to Asunción, Paraguay, flying heroin via Chile, Ecuador, Panama, Jamaica to Florida. Seizures in October to December 1970, 92 and 210 pounds, led to a March 1971 indictment. Ricord was arrested soon after in Asunción. Following sustained U.S. diplomatic pressure, Paraguay extradited him in October 1972. He was convicted and sentenced to 20 years. Collapse. As Ricord's legal peril mounted in 1972, the Sicilians dispatched Buscetta to assist Sarti and establish Brazil as the new hub alongside Christian David and Michel Nicolai. The push failed. Sarti was killed in a Mexico City shootout, April 1972. David and Nicolai were arrested later that year. Buscetta was arrested in November 1972, attempting to flee. Aftermath. François Rossi, a Corsican from Buenos Aires and former Ricord associate, tried to continue operations, smuggling over 2 tons, 1965 to 1973, to Roberto Arenas in New York, using air cargo personnel and routing via Mexico, Miami, and New York. Extradited from Spain in 1975 on $5 million bail, Rossi, like Ricord, David, and Nicolai, ultimately landed in prison. Since the Ricord-Sarti-Rossi collapse, no major South American ring has replaced them. With New York City as the primary distribution hub for French-origin heroin, most imports from 1965 to 1970 were handled by one of the city's 5 LCN families. In the early 1970s, LCN's centrality declined, enabling Black and Latin organizations to gain influence. LCN remained active because of the extraordinary profits, despite significant prosecution risks. In 1965, U.S. Attorney Robert M. Morgenthau stated, "There is not a single large-scale narcotics importing activity in New York City that is independent of the families." The McClellan Committee, 1964, reached the same conclusion, finding heroin trafficking almost entirely operated by La Cosa Nostra, LCN, particularly the 5 families of New York. The Bureau of Narcotics likewise estimated that 95% of heroin smuggled into the U.S. since World War II was controlled by LCN gangsters. Despite repeated reports that LCN bosses had banned heroin involvement, evidence shows the organization remained deeply entrenched in the French Connection pipeline, at least until 1973. A string of convictions confirms the point. 1965, Frank Tuminaro, Frank Gangui, and Rosario Gangui arrested for wholesale heroin distribution. January 1966, John Nuccio, described as the brains behind a stewardess-based smuggling ring, arrested. August 1969, Genovese members Enrico Tomilo, Carmine Palladino, and Robert Santarelli arrested in Washington, D.C. for narcotics conspiracy. 1972, Gambino Captain Joseph Mauladi, convicted of conspiracy to distribute narcotics. Genovese member Victor Pancia also arrested. The most dramatic case came in 1974, when Carmine Tramunti, boss of the Lucchese family, was convicted alongside 43 others for financing a highly organized wholesale heroin operation. The conspiracy, which ran from 1969 to 1973, sold multi-kilogram shipments at $20,000 to $40,000 each. Tramunti acted as banker for the operation, whose principal supplier was Vincent Papa. Vincent Papa, one of the East Coast's most significant heroin importers, trafficked roughly 25 kilograms per week for many years. Papa sourced heroin from a network likely tied to Joseph Orsini's Corsican syndicate, demonstrating ongoing Corsican LCN collaboration. The Berdine investigation illustrates the American end of the French Connection pipeline. The heroin originated in Marseille, possibly from Orsini's laboratories. It was shipped to the US by Jean-Claude Keller, Laurent Fioconi, Joseph Signoli, and Alexandre Salle. Richard Berdine served as the liaison between Marseille suppliers and American buyers. His primary customer was Louis Cirillo, who supplied Vincent Papa. Papa distributed kilograms to Anthony Lauria, a North Babylon dealer who supplied half a dozen New York and Long Island pushers, including Thomas Burke. In late 1971, Berdine was arrested in New York after 19 kilograms of heroin were found in a car shipped aboard an Italian liner. He admitted importing 370 kilograms in less than 2 years. Berdine's organization bought heroin in Marseille for $2,000 per kilogram and sold it in New York for $30,000 per kilogram. Couriers earned $1,000 per kilogram plus expenses. The smuggling was handled by André Labbé, an SDECE assassin. Heroin was transported from Marseille to Paris in a suitcase. A second operative hid it in secret car compartments. A third drove the car to Le Havre. Labbé booked passage and accompanied the heroin to New York. Joseph Signoli managed the French end, financed by Fioconi, who partnered with Keller in New York. After Fioconi and Keller were arrested in 1970, Signoli and Salles took control, though Berdine soon left the group. Berdine's major customer, Louis Cirillo, was arrested with 222 pounds of heroin and admitted importing 2,900 pounds in 2 years. Despite claiming only a bagel shop salary, police found $1,078,000 buried in his backyard. Vincent Papa, closely tied to the Gambino and Lucchesi families, distributed 25 kilograms per week, 1967 to 1971, while posing as a tire company manager. He supplied 2 kilograms weekly to Lauria, who diluted it into 6 kilograms, earning $3 to $4 million annually. The Berdine case shows the full scope of the French Connection. Turkish morphine base, then processed in Francisi Orsini labs, Marseille, then shipped by Corsican smugglers, then distributed by LCN-linked networks in New York. After 1970, LCN no longer monopolized distribution. It allowed independent Italians, Papa, Cirillo, Black and Latin groups, to handle parts of the trade, keeping a share for itself. Latin traffickers, long involved in cocaine and marijuana, began importing heroin in larger quantities in the early 1970s. The French Connection collapsed in 1972 due to a combination of the Turkish opium ban and aggressive enforcement by US and French authorities. Supplying 75 to 80% of US heroin in 1972, French heroin fell to 45% in 1973, 2% in 1974, and virtually zero by 1975. 1968. US lent Turkey $3 million to encourage crop substitution. 1971, June 30th. Under intense US pressure, including threats to cut military economic aid, Turkey banned opium production, allowing the last legal crop to be harvested by June 1972. The US paid $35+ million in compensation to farmers. President Richard Nixon, alarmed by rising addiction, from 52,793 known addicts in 1965 to 560,000 in 1971 and 600,000 in 1972, made destroying the French Connection a foreign policy priority. Heroin had become the leading cause of death among ages 15 to 35 in New York City, spreading from inner cities to the suburbs. Federal narcotics spending rose from $65.9 million, 1969, to $729 million, 1972. Nixon called heroin America's public enemy #1 and pushed a global enforcement strategy. The Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act, 1970, expanded federal power, shifting authority from tax law to interstate commerce. Federal narcotics agents doubled to 1,000, 1969 to 1971. The Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, was established in 1973, consolidating BNDD and other agencies. 3. French enforcement efforts. Heroin addiction in France exploded from 1968 to 1970, with 20,000 addicts in Marseille alone. France responded by increasing narcotics agents fourfold, reorganizing enforcement in 1972, and conducting major raids. By 1971, 19 major traffickers were arrested. 50 more followed in 1973. Heroin seizures rose from 136 kilograms, 1969, to 576 kilograms, January to September 1972. Panama, once a key transshipment point, was largely abandoned by 1972 due to improved security. Although dismantled by 1972, the French connection persisted at a reduced level until about 1975. In April 1975, French heroin again dominated the New York market, likely from stockpiled Turkish opium from 1971 to 1972. July 1974. Turkey lifted the ban, introducing new controls that required harvesting whole pods and drying them before sale. By 1980, production was fully state-controlled. Despite 9,000 tons harvested, poppy cultivation shrank from 204,000 farmers, 1978, to 69,000, 1980. Turkey ceased being a major illicit producer, but emerged as a transit point for Golden Crescent heroin. Reports suggest Corsican chemists began operating Sicilian labs, sending Golden Crescent product to the US. Yet, by the late 1970s, Mexico and Southeast Asia had overtaken the French connection as primary suppliers. As the French connection collapsed, Mexico replaced France as the primary US heroin source. 1965 to 1971. France supplied 80% of US heroin, Mexico 15%. By 1974, Mexico supplied 70 to 80%. By 1975, Mexican heroin reached the East Coast for the first time. New distribution hubs emerged in Chicago and Los Angeles, alongside New York and Miami. Chinese immigrants introduced poppy cultivation to Mexico in the 1920s. LCN members imported small quantities during World War II. Post-war control shifted to independent entrepreneurs and loose networks. Poppies were grown in the remote Sierra Madre Mountains of western Mexico, especially Sinaloa, Sonora, Chihuahua, and Durango. 20,000 to 28,000 acres were hidden among maize and tomato fields in 375,000 square miles of rugged terrain. Local authority was minimal, and opium often grew on government land. Opium farmers earned up to 10 times legal crop income, resisting eradication. Mexican heroin, known as brown sugar, averaged 65% purity. Labs prioritized speed over refinement, producing a brown granular heroin rather than the white powder typical of French product. 1975 peak, 75 tons of raw opium produced, supplying 85 to 90% of the US heroin market. A 1975 DEA study found Mexican heroin the primary source in nearly every US city. Chicago and Boston, 100% Mexican origin, New York, 83% Mexican origin, one Texas route. The primary route crossed the Texas border. 80% of heroin entered by land, 15% by air, 5% by sea. Much of the Rio Grande is shallow enough to wade across. Jeeps can ford it near Laredo. 15 international bridges and 2 dams offered additional crossings. Arizona became another key corridor. Smugglers moved heroin, cocaine, and marijuana across the 360-mile border by plane, truck, car, horse, or foot. Reasons: sparse population, 2,000 clandestine airstrips, and well-financed smuggling groups on both sides. 23 major organizations were identified by 1977, including 5 partly or fully controlled by LCN families from New York, Detroit, and Chicago. Smuggling infrastructure was vast. Hundreds of dirt trails crossed the border. Nogales alone hosted 85-plus groups in 1977. Nearby Tucson was the main distribution point, with Phoenix also significant. 550 pilots were flying drugs into nearby fields. Law enforcement was outmatched. Just 181 DEA and local agents patrolled 113,909 square miles across 14 counties. The Phoenix police were 800 officers understaffed, with a vice unit of only 12. Corruption was endemic. 1976. Pinal County Attorney Lloyd Brumage fled to Mexico under indictment. Pima County Undersheriff convicted of obstructing justice. 1977. Sheriff candidate Reynaldo Nobles arrested mid-campaign for leading a marijuana ring. LCN influence was substantial. 200 LCN members lived in Arizona in 1977. Known figures: Anthony Tisci, Sam Giancana's son-in-law, Joseph Bonanno, and Peter Licavoli, son of Detroit boss Horseface Licavoli. Bonanno, who established the Montreal-New York heroin pipeline in the 1950s, reportedly sought to control Arizona's drug trade and met with Victor Zavala, brother of one of Mexico's top 2 heroin dealers, March 1, 1976. Bonanno allegedly routed heroin through Pueblo, Colorado to St. Louis and other cities. Anthony Tony the Ant Spilotro, Chicago Ocado family, moved $8 million per year in Mexican heroin to Chicago. Antonio Gambino, brother of Carlo Gambino, visited Douglas, Arizona in December 1971 to establish a distribution base. 4 days after meeting a pilot in Tucson, the pilot, a U.S. Customs informant, was shot twice but survived. Peter Licavoli Jr. sent heroin and cocaine to St. Louis, Detroit, Youngstown, Boston, Anchorage, and Anaheim. Other smugglers included Hector Ma Wong, who led a father-son ring supplying major U.S. and Canadian cities, Jesus Rosales Ramirez, kilo-level dealer, Geral Leon Woods, 70-member ring, and the Colino Perez Group, 40-member outfit supplied by Spilotro. South Florida was always a side door into New York. In the 1970s, it swung wide open. What had been a secondary route turned into a $4 billion a year business. After the French Connection collapsed and LCN lost its grip on the pipeline, Cuban crews and black syndicates filled the vacuum. They had what they needed: thousands of miles of coastline, more than 50 small airports with no customs on the field, banks that didn't blink at thick stacks of cash, lawyers and accountants who knew how to make it all look clean, brokers who'd sell planes, yachts, cars, or land to anyone with a briefcase, and moonlighting mechanics who slipped long-range tanks into twin-engine puddle jumpers. Heroin blended in with the cocaine and the weed, one cargo among many. By 1977, 8 major networks were moving Mexican brown from Los Angeles to Miami, and then up to New York. Miami joined LA, Tucson, and El Paso as a top center for Mexican product, and the street networks followed. Black distributors took their cut of the South Florida flow. In Mexico, 2 organizations dwarfed the rest: the Herrera family out of Durango and a Culiacan crew around Jorge Savela. Federal agents said the Herreras had been dealing into the states for almost 20 years, controlling a major share of Chicago, and shipping big loads to New York, Boston, Baltimore, D.C., Miami, San Juan, and Los Angeles. In Chicago alone, the DEA put their profit at $100 million a year. They weren't middlemen. They were manufacturers, wholesalers, and retailers. A family cartel of roughly 1,000 on payroll, 2,000 by other counts, built from 15 intermarried clans. The elders stayed in Mexico, ran the poppy fields, cooked morphine base into heroin, and managed the cross-border moves and cash returns. The younger generation handled American sales. Headquarters was Victoria de Durango, high in the Sierra Madre, where 7 makeshift labs did volume, not perfection. No Marseille cleanroom, just fast cooks that produced brown sugar. They cut purity themselves to about 20%, kept the margins, and kept outsiders out. Chicago was their capital. Police said almost every major dealer in the city took orders from Durango. LCN had no seat at that table. From what we're aware of, not a thing, a cop said about any relationship between the mob and the Herreras. There's nobody at the upper echelon who's not a Mexican from that particular family. The Herreras controlled the business end. Freelancers ran the border and the corners. Each kilo crossing into the US threw off about $17,000 to the family. The cash hit currency exchanges, turned into money orders, and disappeared south by courier or mail. In US cities, Herrera people kept quiet, lived in Mexican neighborhoods, and blended. Between 1974 and 1976, more than 80 family members were arrested here. The machine kept grinding. The boss was Jaime Herrera Nevarez, a former Mexican police sergeant. Agents said his factories pushed about 1.5 tons of heroin a year, roughly a quarter of the US market. Brothers Manuel and Elias handled crops and production in Durango. A fourth brother, Reyes, ran the Chicago end. The break came on a hot June run. Near the Texas line, troopers popped Alfredo Alamo Ramirez with 23 pounds hidden in a gas tank. He flipped, drove on into Chicago under surveillance, and led agents to a garage where they seized another 17 pounds and 94 grand in cash. 3 major dealers caught 45 years each. 2 key Herreras fell in July. Jaime fled to Mexico after an indictment, then surrendered a year later. Feds said that single crackdown kept 1.5 tons of heroin off the street. On the West Coast, Jaime Araujo ran a Los Angeles combine that did what most traffickers avoided. It kept records. From September 1975 to October 1976, the books showed $32.8 million through the accounts, heroin and cocaine. When they hit one of his houses, they found 100 pounds of heroin, 47 morphine base, 30 cocaine, street value $180 million. Araujo never talked on a phone and smoked out surveillance for 3 years. What got him wasn't a wire, it was money. DEA, Customs, and IRS followed $32 million as it ping-ponged between banks in California and Tijuana. In court, he caught conspiracy and tax counts, 35 years and a $1.2 million fine. The lesson was simple. If you won't touch the dope, the money will still touch you. Henry Duane Watson introduced Mexican heroin to the East when the French supply dried up. He lived in fortified LA houses with steel doors and bars and dealt with Culiacan suppliers who played it old school and simple. A car went south, got loaded, then parked near the border in Mexicali or San Luis Rio, Colorado. The crew swapped on a spare tire packed with 4 kilos and drove slow, the tire unbalanced, the load better not jostled, through customs. On the US side, they swapped tires again and ran it into Los Angeles. The Mexican-Cuban link was Pedro Fifth Lugo. He bought at $20,000 a kilo, sold at $24,000 to $29,000. Watson cut one into 5, sold at $1,000 to $1,200 an ounce, and the street paid $2,000 an ounce, $250,000 a kilo, end to end. Watson's mother served as banker. Cash lived in her closet. Couriers delivered suitcases of money to Lugo. Cars came back with trunks full of heroin, or sat in supermarket lots with keys hidden, waiting for pickup. Watson's network ran national: Dallas, Tucson, Atlanta, Miami, Rochester, St. Louis, Washington. A buyer called his answering service and got the code, "Sky her out." Put a courier on a plane to LA. Most were young women. They checked into a motel, called back, took delivery. Heroin flew east in baby powder cans. Cash came back under dresses in padded girdles and inside boots. In May 1976, Watson and 39 others were indicted on conspiracy. He pleaded and took 15 years. Behind the walls, another syndicate grew teeth. The Mexican Mafia, La M, started at Duel Vocational in 1957, when 13 Chicanos formed a protection club. They were barrio kids from East LA transplanted into the yard. Within a decade, they had chapters across California and supposedly controlled San Quentin's yard. Membership was blood in, blood out. You beat or killed on order, and you were voted into the car. There was no easy exit. They treated the prisons like hubs. Families were forced to mule on visiting days. From inside, they choreographed planes, boats, oil trucks, and human couriers. In La Mesa prison in Tijuana, one chapter grossed $3 million a month and ran a clearinghouse for heroin, coke, marijuana, hash, and pills. 3 inmates directed traffic from the border to LA, San Diego, Vancouver, and sometimes New York, sourcing from Mexico and Southeast Asia through South America. Parolees built the routes into the yards. Guards looked the other way or were too scared to interfere. They didn't stop at fences. In 1971, from a cell in Chino, leader Rudolph Cheyenne Cadena sent coded notes to parolees to take over SPAN, a federal drug program bankrolled by the National Institute of Mental Health. A Mexican Mafia recruit landed on staff to find counselors, and the program collapsed in months. They penetrated Lucha next, a legit treatment non-profit, where member Eduardo Z. Aguirre became director and used HUD money to widen the gang's footprint in LA drug markets. They surfaced in 2 more outfits, Community Concern Corporation and Get Going, Incorporated. In 2 years, 300 was tied to 6 homicides. Get Going's vehicles showed up in 7 murders, and their prison access became a communications channel to shoot callers. The US started arming Mexico for eradication before Mexico became the main supplier. In 1968, we bought them 5 helicopters and 3 airplanes. But it wasn't until 1974 to 76 that a real joint offensive took hold. Mexico passed a law to seize poppy lands and torched 6,000 fields. By 1976, they had 200 new paid agents in the field. We put 27 helicopters and a fleet of patrol planes in the air. Infrared cameras spotted fields. Choppers sprayed herbicide that killed poppies in 4 hours. By March 1976, more than 16,000 fields, enough to cook 4.5 tons of heroin, were gone, and 233 pounds were seized. Over the next 2 years, another 70,000 fields were destroyed. Mexico's output fell to about 6 metric tons a year. Under the Janus Agreement, Mexican fugitives who dealt in the States and ran south were prosecuted at home. By 1979, Washington had spent $68 million on the program. Big fields got carved into patches hidden in canyons. National purity hit a decade low, 3.5% on the street. Mexican heroin slid to about 2% purity. Just 35% of federal seizures, and an estimated 28% of the US supply. For the first time in a decade, the addict count dropped hard. Heroin deaths fell from roughly 150 a month to about 30, but the demand didn't vanish. A new market, richer middle class, started smoking and snorting. Mexican Brown's reputation for punch made it fashionable, and when Mexico faded, Asia and the Middle East stepped in. By the late 70s, Southeast Asia eclipsed Mexico. The Golden Triangle, where Burma, Thailand and Laos meet, had been pouring out opium since the mid-60s. Most of it was consumed locally. Some fed the GIs during Vietnam. By 1972, our people knew what was coming. By the end of the decade, it was here. In 1 year, 38% of US heroin traced to Southeast Asia. In 1981, it was 36% despite eradication drives. Burma produced most of the raw product. Thailand moved the morphine base. Hong Kong, Singapore, Kuala Lumpur, and Manila became refining and transshipment hubs. More than half of the loads hit the States by commercial or private plane, about 35% by sea, the rest overland, often via Venezuela. Early on, the trade was loose. Ethnic Chinese seamen based in Laos, Thailand and Hong Kong carried for pay and jumped ship in American ports. There were rumors of Chinese crews working with Corsican chemists and FCM, Marseille-style labs in the hills. Nothing solid ever proved it. What was solid was the volume. By 1975, Golden Triangle heroin was turning up in New York in serious weight. For the first time, the East Coast was getting Asian product by the pallet, not the ounce. Europe didn't see it coming. In 75, Southeast Asian heroin started pouring in, and for the first time Western Europe wasn't just a pass-through to the States, it was a market. Amsterdam took Marseille's crown. By 76, European cops were seizing more heroin than the US, and the weight of Golden Triangle product they grabbed matched the entire world's seizures from other sources the year before. The French connection had died in 72. Mexico filled the void in America. Europe got cut loose and went shopping in Asia. When our troops left Vietnam, the same labs that fed GIs began shipping west. Asia had run permissive for years. Corruption, poverty and war don't leave much room for crop substitution speeches. Two products defined the region. Number 3, a smokable purplish street grade branded like candy, and number 4, China White, lab clean at 90+% purity, peddled in tidy packets, and, by the late 70s, arriving in the US almost exclusively as stepped-down number 4. They even cooked a hybrid, heroin K, opium, morphine base and aspirin, plus an extra strong W glube the troops bought in 70 to 72. Burma was the source that mattered. 40% of the world's opium, some said, moved down from the northeast toward Thailand. Horse and donkey caravans crossed the hills near Mongsu, hit the Salween, slipped through Mongping and Mongsat, and came out at Marseille in Thailand. The Shan United Army controlled the borderlands with a few thousand soldiers and modern weapons, and for years cut deals with communist guerrillas, safe passage in exchange for muscle. They controlled 2/3 of Burma's opium until the politics flipped in 1980, and Shan units lined up with the communists against Rangoon. At the center was Khoon Sa, Chang Chi-fu, calling shots from Ban Hin Taik, Thailand. By 78, DEA put him and his partners at a quarter of the world's illicit opium. He personally accounted for 15% of US heroin. Opium wasn't even half his business. Jade and consumer goods meant steady cash. The dope brought leverage. He ran 2 refinery complexes near Tachilek and Mae Hong Son. Between them, the Lahu National Liberation Army operated a 3rd. A dozen more plants dotted the line just inside Burma. Khoon Sa even offered to sell his entire output to the US government for $6 to $12 million. Washington passed. You don't buy from a rebel while backing the government he's trying to topple. Laos was smaller. The Mao and Aka grew about 10% of the region's opium and used it like a bank account. They were anti-communist and nominally under Vientiane's wing, which meant the 1971 ban on poppies was theatre. Royal Laotian forces were accused of protecting the trade while morphine base ran down the Mekong to Saigon or over to Thailand for cooking. Thailand was the hinge. Ethnic Chinese networks ran the trade from market towns like Phang, 12 miles from the Burma line, along hidden trails out of Burma, Laos, even Yunnan. The law said, "No opium since '58. The Hills said, "This is how we eat." A 1972 estimate put 165,000 people in the northern Thai traffic. For years, displaced Kuomintang units, driven out of Yunnan in 1949 and Burma by 1962, guarded caravans and taxed the flow. In '62, they tried to cut in on Shan deliveries to the Royal Laotian Army. 1,000 KMT troops hit a 300-donkey Shan caravan. The Laotian Air Force bombed both sides. Laos won the right to tax Burmese heroin at Hue Sai. By '72, the KMT were done and promised to stop smuggling. Tea became the public crop. The dope kept moving, just with different escort badges. Routes evolved with pressure. Bangkok and Penang were classic exit doors for air couriers, but as Thai enforcement stiffened, loads bypassed Bangkok refineries and moved south overland to coastal labs, then out by sea. Lines to the US ran Bangkok to Singapore, to Hong Kong, to the States, or Saigon, to ocean drops in the Gulf of Siam to Hong Kong, or Singapore to the East Coast via the Middle East and Europe. Hong Kong said it wasn't a transshipment point anymore by 1979. US agents laughed. It was still a finance hub with banks that washed money and no currency declarations in or out, plus 35,000 to 100,000 local addicts to keep supplied. Big loads came off fishing trawlers near the PRC-controlled Lima Islands and slipped into the harbour on junks. From there, 2 waypoints fed America, Guam and Hawaii. Guam's position made it a perfect hop between Southeast Asia and Honolulu. Most heroin arrived by air or ship. Seizures were low for lack of manpower, the overdose rate climbed, and arrests ticked up. In Hawaii, the purity told the story, mid-40% on the street in '77, while Mexican brown on the mainland hovered around 2.5. Commercial airlines did most of the work. Private boats, cargo, and the mail helped. Rings operating from Honolulu included a Czechoslovak crew, the Japanese Yakuza, and the Sumiyoshi Rengo. Names surfaced with the routes. Lo Xinghan, Chinese-born, was Burma's kingpin. The government asked him to form a militia against the Shan. He financed it with opium. When the fighting eased, he went full-time into the trade. In 1973, Burmese forces pushed him into Thailand and arrested him with nearly 4 tons of opium. He confessed to moving 80-plus tons between '67 and '72. His case went quiet when he began naming officials. One Pen Phen, the Phantom, ran £4,500 a month to US troops in Vietnam. He and his American fixer, Joseph Berger, fell in '72. In Hong Kong, the 14K triad boasted more than 50,000 members and rules that made informants extinct. If you talk, your whole family dies. They were said to touch US mobsters before Carmine Galante got clipped. Scandinavian merchant seamen ran a line for Chinese distributors into Canada, New York, and San Francisco. One tip let DEA grab 300 pounds of heroin and 100 of cocaine. An Australian ring got popped in New York in '67 on Hong Kong supply. In 1972, a Philippine diplomat was caught in Manhattan with 40 pounds of pure Golden Triangle heroin. Cops pushed back. In Laos, the pitch was crops, potatoes and melons instead of poppies. Burma launched a 3-year campaign in '66, pamphlets, arrests, the death penalty by '73 for manufacturing, trafficking, or contracting with an international ring. By '75, US helicopters sprayed poppy fields while Burmese intel chiefs trained in America. Still, 3 kinds of smugglers persisted: breakaway KMT elements, the Shan United Army, and the Kachin Independence Army. By 1979, Burma had 100,000 addicts and too many open country to police. Thailand took money from the US and the UN, 17 million in 72 for treatment and rehab, stood up mobile strike teams, seized half a ton in 2 days, resettled KMT fighters, and in 1979 to 80 tightened with Burma while the Thai parliament passed a death penalty law for traffickers. Even drought didn't kill the business for long. The 78 to 79 season fell to 200 metric tons. By 81, the crop jumped to 600, triple the prior 2 years. Golden Triangle heroin still covered roughly 38% of the US market in 1979. Then the map flipped. The Golden Crescent, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, took over. In 1979, drought crushed triangle output to maybe 160 to 200 metric tons. The Middle East ran the table. Afghanistan 300, Pakistan 700, Iran 600. Five-fold increases over 5 years. In 1980, the Crescent produced 1,600 metric tons, 5 to 9 times the rest of the world combined. In 75 to 76, the Crescent barely registered in US seizures at 1%. By 17 it was 8, 17 it was 17, 19 it was 30 plus, and climbing in 1980. The region's borderlands are ruled by tribes who don't salute central governments. Opium is currency for guns. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan stripped Kabul of authority in the poppy provinces. Pakistan's politics jammed up crop replacement programs. Iran's revolution erased the narcotics police and the old controls. Afghanistan was always primed. A farm country with a new government every few years, and a police force 2% literate. Helmand Valley, Badakhshan, and Nangarhar grew the bulk. For years, the product went to Iranian addicts. By 72, our people flagged it as a US threat. Kabul tried, 73 to 74 after the monarchy fell, again in 77 with US help. Nothing stuck. You can't ask a mountain farmer to swap potatoes without roads, water, and power. Morphine base is light, valuable, and malleable. Aid money came in. Poppies went in the ground. Pakistan's poppies sit in the Karakoram, the northwest frontier, where Islamabad's writ fades. Pathan farmers grow. Coochie caravans move. Donkeys, camels, trucks, to Karachi for sea shipments to European labs, or overland into Iran and up to Turkey. The Iranian Revolution made the overland route even safer. The Iran-Iraq War later pushed caravans north. At home, opium is medicine, sold by licensed shops to registered addicts. In 1971, 6 tons went out the front door legally. 60 more slipped out the back, and morphine sulfate tablets, a heroin substitute, were pressed in country and mailed across Europe. In March 1980, Pakistan outlawed cultivation. The pitch was devout, Islamic duty, and economic development funds for the hills. A bumper, 1979 crop pushed prices so low some fields weren't worth planting. DEA worried the surplus would just convert to heroin for the states. Then the president fell in 81 and the policy fell with him. Iran rode a roller coaster. In 1955, 2 million addicts. The Shah banned poppies, torched fields, and threw users into forced withdrawal. Before the ban, Iran grew 700 tons a year. He lifted the ban in 69 under controls and executed 130 smugglers by 72. It held, barely, until the revolution. Khomeini banned drugs in 1979, except for current addicts, and in 1980 put Ayatollah Sadegh Khalkhali over narcotics. Hundreds of smugglers were executed in Baluchistan and Kurdistan. Still, the new government didn't have the legs to police the trade. Turkey re-entered the story, not as a grower, but as a processor and pipeline. labs sprouted near the Iranian border to turn opium into morphine base. From there, the drug moved two ways. Migrant workers carried it into Western Europe, especially West Germany, which had the second largest addict population after the US, and where heroin was so pure people smoked it, or shipments ran to Syria, and Lebanon got loaded on freighters and landed in Mediterranean ports, chiefly Sicily, for finishing and distribution. In a decade, the center of gravity moved from Marseille to Amsterdam, from Mexican brown to Asian white, from donkey trains on the Salween to Camaros on I-95, from jungle labs to border refineries. Every time a government shut a door, Turkey's opium ban, Thai raids, Mexican spraying, the traffic found another. It was a business, compartmentalized and resilient. Caravans and couriers, refineries and bankers, diplomats and sailors, prisons and non-profits. Switch the route, change the cut, move the money. The names changed, the playbook didn't. Morphine base moved across the Mediterranean like contraband currency. Sicilian boats met freighters at night in the Sicilian Channel, took the morphine base aboard, and turned it into heroin in kitchens and countryside labs run by Cosa Nostra technicians. Couriers carried the finished product on commercial flights, an estimated 3 tons a year headed for the United States. Sometimes it hit New York sidewalks in under 48 hours, fresh from Sicily and still warm from the cook. By the late 1970s, the Sicilians had pushed aside the Union course and resumed the flow to America. Cooperation didn't disappear, it shifted. There were signs of Sicilian-Corsican coordination when it suited the load and the route. Large quantities went straight to La Cosa Nostra in New York. Wholesale business handled between people who understood volume, risk, and silence. Police made dents, but couldn't hold the ground. In 1979, they found 2 labs in Marseille, one stocked with more than 90 pounds of heroin. That November, they grabbed another lab near the French border in Italy and arrested Antoine Nestori, a chemist with French connection credentials. The same period turned up other sites, a refining complex near Nice in August and another operation in Milan in November. Then the system snapped back. In December 1979, the morphine base, 20 kilograms, and heroin, 13.5 kilograms, seized in the Nestori raid, allegedly vanished from police custody. By 1980, Italian authorities had uncovered 3 additional facilities geared to the US market. 25 people were arrested, 5 French chemists, 18 Italians, 2 exporters. That same year, US authorities opened unclaimed suitcases at JFK and found 53 pounds of pure heroin. Cosa Nostra no longer lived only in western Sicily's rural strongholds. By 1965, it had reached Turin, Milan, and Naples. There was no formal organizational umbilical cord to the American families, but ties existed wherever money moved. Cooperation on shipments was routine. Italian cops made their plays. In one sweep, they took down 17 top bosses. Pezzi di 90, the big shots, on drug conspiracy charges. A few years earlier, 73 mafiosi were handed prison terms, including rival heroin ringleaders Pietro Torretta and Angelo La Barbera. In 1971, a parliamentary commission named 13 mafia leaders and didn't hedge, killers, traffickers, capable of anything. Tommaso Buscetta, later famous for talking, was already on US soil under arrest for helping Rickard and Rosario Mancio, and counted as a major trafficker. While Europe chased labs, the raw volume coming from the Golden Crescent changed the math. Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran. Together they could spin enough opium into morphine base for 80 tons of heroin a year, more than 10 times US consumption. The DEA figured they were seizing only 2 to 5% of what entered the country. There were no diplomatic relations with Iran or Afghanistan to help dam the source. The numbers started to show. In New York City, drug deaths jumped 77% in 1979. Arrests for heroin possession and trafficking rose 85%. Golden Crescent dope joined continued shipments from Southeast Asia's Golden Triangle and a growing menu of synthetics. The problem hadn't been solved, it had been outgrown. Half the heroin entering the United States ended up in New York City, according to law enforcement estimates. Addicts there were linked to more than half the city's street crimes and burglaries. From 1965 to 1970, the 5 families and their close associates handled most of the city's heroin traffic. During the 1970s, Black and Hispanic groups broke that hold and took over the bulk of the street and mid-level trade. La Cosa Nostra stayed important in importation and wholesale, but ceded the corners. Until Mexican and Asian product took over in 1975 to 1980, New York's users lived on French Connection heroin. In 1972, the city staggered under a shortage triggered by Turkey's opium ban. The flow didn't stop. In 1973, New York State passed a hard-line drug law, handed out more than 100 life sentences, and still didn't slow the market. By the end of 1975, usage was being compared to the 1969 to 1970 peak. Fewer narcotics officers after the French Connection collapse and the rise of non-LCN dealers fueled the rebound. Investigators in the late 1970s said it was getting worse. After World War II into the late 60s, the 5 New York families dominated heroin. The Lucchese and Bonanno families built the original Marseille-Montreal-New York route. In 1968, a state committee counted 600 LCN soldiers working Harlem, Bedford-Stuyvesant, and the South Bronx. That crew handled about $116 million in narcotics that year, with estimated profits north of $90 million annually in the late 60s. By 1970, LCN got off the sidewalk and moved deeper into importation and wholesale financing. They fronted money, insured shipments, and let others take the hand-to-hand risk. The market was too big, penalties too steep, and conspiracy laws too sharp after the convictions of men like Katina and La Rocca. The myth of a single Mr. Big evaporated. What remained was a cluster of arm's-length relationships between major independent operators, LCN as a system, not a monopoly. They adapted their smuggling too. Diplomats and couriers became tools. Mexican and Uruguayan diplomats did time for heroin smuggling. Couriers hid 6-kilogram lots behind lavatory trash cans on jetliners and walked off in Chicago after boarding in New York, switching airlines to bypass customs. By 1975, control of city distribution had flipped. Black and Hispanic organizations, wired into Mexican and Southeast Asian supply lines, broke free of LCN gatekeeping. Police intelligence, focused for years on white-run networks, missed the turnover. The new rings matured without pressure. By 1968, Black and Puerto Rican wholesalers were already visible at the mid to upper tiers, even as importation remained mostly in LCN hands. In 1975, law enforcement listed 13 major New York dealers. 4 were LCN, 5 Black, 4 Hispanic cocaine traffickers transitioning into heroin lanes. Joseph and Charles Di Palermo, tied to the Tranchina/Tramunti orbit, ran a large heroin setup from Little Italy. Virgil Alessi succeeded Vincent Papa on Queens distribution. Ralph Tutino moved weight in Harlem until 1973, with Mexican and Asian supply, while other LCN dealers lost pipelines after the French Connection fell apart. On the black side, Leroy Nikki Barnes led the biggest outfit. James Lofton, Frank Lucas, Stephen Monsanto, and Robert Stepney were top players. Along with Stanley Morgan, they formed the Council of 12, the Harlem boardroom for heroin. Lucas built a direct line to Asian opium sources and ran with Southern transplants, focused on Harlem. In January 1976, he drew 40 years for distributing more than 100 pounds of heroin. In April 1977, he was indicted for running the organization from a federal cell. Even locked up, the operation grossed more than $50 million a year. By September 1977, Lucas admitted he was still giving orders. 3 brothers were convicted as his aides. Robert Stepney of Teaneck, New Jersey, started as a financier. After Barnes's arrest, he pushed into heroin and cocaine, trying to take the throne and failing. He was arrested in November 1978. Rufus Boyd, another heavy dealer, drew 40 years on a conspiracy case in 1976. In the South Bronx, Jaime teenager Vila ran a $30 million ring until his 1978 arrest. Called the Puerto Rican Nikki Barnes, he shipped multi-kilo loads from Los Angeles. His Mexican heroin sold at 15 to 30% purity because the chemistry made it hard to cut. Vila came in sideways. In 1973, Bronx dealer David Lopez built a Mexican connection through Los Angeles. Vila was friends with Lopez's manager, Julio Lopez. Their families came from the same street in San Sebastián, Puerto Rico. Vila spun his own organization and brought in a Mexican chemist, Bernardo Romero Verdico. For distribution, he partnered with cocaine dealer Ray Rodriguez, a Julio enemy. When Rodriguez got hooked on heroin, Vila took full control. The Vila-Rodriguez alliance ignited a feud with Julio that left 27 known dead by the time Vila went down. Harlem was always the city's heroin capital. Its major dealers controlled most of the product available across the boroughs. Charles Green was the first widely known boss. Arrested in 1970, he had more than 100 pushers and couriers and moved heroin and cocaine out of South America. Frank Matthews took the baton and widened the map. Introduced into heroin by LCN associate Louis Cirillo and supplied by Auguste Ricard, Matthews was, by 1968, sending heroin into all major East Coast cities and into Atlanta, Cleveland, Detroit, Cincinnati, Chicago, Kansas City, and Los Angeles. In January 1972, Miami seized 385 pounds of heroin bound for Matthews, the largest U.S. seizure to that point. He jumped bail in 1973 and disappeared. Leroy Nikki Barnes stepped into the vacuum and became one of the East Coast's dominant dealers. Mr. Untouchable had been arrested 13 times between 1950 and 1977 for everything from bribery to murder, and spent little time inside. He grew up in Harlem and became an addict himself. After he kicked the habit, he sold as a mid-level dealer for a Dominican crew through the 50s and early 60s. In 1965, he built his own group with LCN Supply. A 25-to-life sentence sent him to Green Haven, where he met Joey Gallo. Gallo got him a lawyer, a key witness vanished. The conviction was reversed in 1969. Barnes went to work for William Goldfinger Terrell, one of Harlem's top heroin bosses, and inherited the organization when Terrell went to jail in 1971. Barnes opened his own mills and took control of manufacturing and sales from upstate New York to Pennsylvania and into Chicago and Arizona. In Harlem and beyond, his people pushed LCN associates off many street corners. By 1976, he ran at least 7 lieutenants, each commanding dozens of mid-level distributors, feeding as many as 40 street sellers apiece. A single lieutenant could control more than $1 million in monthly cash flow. Barnes stayed off the product. His discipline stayed on the men. 2 lieutenants, Stanley Morgan and Reggie Isaacs, were allegedly murdered for disloyalty. He lived large, a Mercedes, a Maserati, multiple Cadillacs, Lincolns, Thunderbirds, 300 suits, 100 pairs of shoes, 50 leather coats, 25 hats, according to police. 5 homes, 2 in New Jersey, 2 in New York, and a $1.2 million stake in a Detroit housing project. Before Christmas, 1976, he handed out turkeys in the neighborhood. He studied his own cases like a paralegal. He bought transcripts page by page, had them bound, highlighted surveillance passages, and distributed the key parts to lieutenants. From 1965 to 1967, in prison, he subscribed to 37 law journals and considered himself an expert. The Barnes case started in fall 1973. The DEA formed the Unified Intelligence Division, 54 hand-picked agents from DEA, NYPD, and New York State Police, to map New York's supply and distribution. They believed unknown Harlem players controlled a multi-city network, touching Boston, Atlanta, and Detroit. For months, agents in vans videotaped buys on Harlem streets and staked out after-hours clubs where major dealers met. By May 1976, they had 17 primary targets. Barnes sat at the top. The Southern District Conspiracy Group, run by DEA agent Donald Ferrarone, focused on him. In September 1976, Ferrarone got the first break. Nassau County called a shoplifter who said he knew Barnes's operation. The informant, Francisi Bruce, had turned activist and wanted to hurt Barnes for what heroin was doing to black neighborhoods. In October, Bruce set up controlled buys and sold Manite to one of Barnes's lieutenants and to Barnes himself. Next came an FBI crossover. Robert Geronimo, an FBI informant, agreed to work with DEA agent Luis Diaz, who posed as a trafficker seeking a connection. They arranged to purchase a 1/4 kilogram from a Barnes associate. On the way to the meet, the contact, Wally Fisher, spotted a car full of DEA agents and ran into a bar. 5 days later, Diaz made the buy. Fisher bragged about the quality and said it came from Barnes. 2 weeks later, Geronimo met with Barnes and a top lieutenant. Diaz started laundering money for the organization. He then bought heroin from Stephen Monsanto, one of Barnes's inner circle and a city-level target himself. After one purchase, Barnes walked in, put an arm around Monsanto, and talked at length. On February 25, 1977, Geronimo and Diaz set up a 1 kilogram purchase for $55,000. A court-ordered wiretap picked up Barnes's men, planning the details. Bruce kept producing, a half block of Manite to Barnes, 50 cases to a lieutenant, and 250 bags of heroin bought on the street under surveillance. On March 15, 1977, agents boxed in Barnes's car at a Harlem light and arrested him. The charge was the Continuing Criminal Enterprise Statute. 17 others were named, 5 chief lieutenants among them. The statute demanded proof of substantial income from narcotics. The IRS returns told their own story. Barnes and his people reporting $250,000 each year in miscellaneous income they couldn't explain. The trial produced some of the heaviest narcotic sentences in city history. Barnes got life without parole and a $125,000 fine. The judge called him the greatest narcotics threat the court had seen in years. Monsanto, Steve Baker, Leon Johnson, Wayman Hines, and John Halleku drew 30 years. Joseph Hayden, the number 2, got 15. The Court of Appeals upheld the verdict. The Supreme Court declined review. By February 1979, Frank James and Guy Fisher had taken over much of the Barnes network. They ran heroin, cocaine, and PCP as partners of convenience, but at a smaller scale. Rumors that Barnes still directed the show from Marion, Illinois, were never confirmed. The conviction's impact didn't change the street. No measurable drop in sales after he went away. NYPD made big cases and still lost the larger fight. A 1971 state investigation called the department's narcotics effort a failure, a monumental waste of manpower and money. The reasons were spelled out: corruption, poor training, weak supervision, and quotas that pushed officers to make numbers off low-level sellers instead of dismantling wholesalers. The rot showed up in the evidence room. In 1973, the city admitted that 1/5 of all heroin seized by NYPD between 1961 and 1972 had been stolen from the police property department. Through the mid to late 70s, as officials convinced themselves the heroin problem was easing, NYPD thinned narcotics squads, only to watch overdose spikes and supply rebound. By 1979, investigators said there were more drugs on the street than ever. The number of narcotics investigators kept falling. 700 in 1974 to 325 in 1980. The product changed too. In Harlem, brands returned. For the first time since 1974, there was no Mexican brown in the city, another sign that old sources were surging. In 1981, Manhattan District Attorney Robert Morgenthau called heroin usage a crisis. He listed the core obstacles: budget cuts, lack of federal commitment, no long-term planning, and a bail system that couldn't hold traffickers. Nothing substantial changed after that assessment. In 1968, the city's chief medical examiner said drug-related diseases, mostly heroin addiction, killed more New Yorkers aged 15 to 35 than murder, suicide, accidents, or natural causes. 85% of deaths in that group were tied to narcotics. 90% were men. Half were black, 30% Puerto Rican, 20% white. The average age at death was 27, down from 33 a decade earlier. Between 1950 and 1954, New York recorded 465 heroin fatalities. From 1955 to 1959, it rose to 611. From 1960 to 1964, 1,299. The years 1965 to 1969 brought 2,935 deaths, more than 900 in 1969 alone. That year, 224 teenagers died of heroin overdoses, 20 of them under 15, the youngest 12 years old. Almost a decade later, in 1978, heroin deaths fell to 246. The next year they jumped back to 439. The 1980 estimate pushed beyond 600. Every indicator turned upward. In 1979, New York's heroin emergency room episodes jumped 46%, from 480 to 702. Admissions to drug programs statewide rose 26% to 26,303. Methadone enrollments climbed 22%. Detox admissions rose 40% from 1978 to 1979. A 1968 New York Times study laid out the damage in Spanish Harlem. Over 4 years, on one slum block of 1,750 residents, 1/3 of teenagers interviewed in winter 1965 were addicts by 1968. More than 3/4 of the adult addicts paid for heroin with petty theft, prostitution, burglary, or dealing. Only 1/3 of the 1965 list had quit by 1968. No one ever counted the addicts cleanly. The estimates collided. In 1968, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics listed 32,347 addicts in New York State, out of 62,405 nationwide, while NYPD estimates for the city alone ran 50,000 to 100,000. In 1965, Mayor Wagner said there were 23,000 city addicts. A Harlem source put 25,000 in that neighborhood alone. By 1967, the Times reported a city figure of 100,000. Through the mid-1970s, the consensus hovered at 150,000. By decade's end, it settled back around 100,000. One city report cut through the fog. The Mayor's Narcotics Control Council said that between 1964 and 1970, New York had 316,918 narcotics addicts, 90% on heroin. That worked out to 1 in every 44 residents aged 15 to 44. The city still turned up massive loads. In December 1969, cops found 35.2 pounds of heroin and 44 pounds of cocaine in a suitcase, 16 plastic bags, inside an apartment. They arrested 3 Chileans and an Argentine tied to LCN. In 1970, a single raid netted 220 pounds of heroin worth $60 million, 4 suitcases and a small metal trunk in a closet. 2 Uruguayans, 1 Chilean, 1 Spaniard, were arrested. No one could say how it entered the country. In August 1970, police broke a national ring moving 850 kilograms a year, about $500 million, out of Marseille. The first sign had come in 1968, inside a jet washroom at JFK. The plane had originated in Frankfurt and was headed to Chicago. Agents watched a courier board at JFK, retrieve the stash, get off in Chicago, and buy a New York ticket on another airline to dodge customs with the load. Jack Grosby and Louis Steffenberg were indicted as the heads. They'd moved heroin in fish cans, cars, typewriters, and banana crates. From night runs in the Sicilian Channel to suitcases at JFK, from Marseille kitchens to Harlem mills, the heroin business kept changing its shape and partners. The supply shifted Corsican to Sicilian, Golden Triangle to Golden Crescent. The faces on the street changed, LCN wholesalers to black and Hispanic syndicates, with the same white-glove bankers and bent officials smoothing the edges. The numbers told the story better than any theory. More dead in the morgue, more addicts on the block, more drugs in circulation, and only a sliver seized. The city fought, scored wins, and watched the stream keep coming. In 1968, Americans spent about $5 million on cocaine. By 1980, the DEA put the U.S. retail market at $12 to $16 billion. Reporters who lived on the phones said it could be as high as $30 billion. National surveys in 1979 confirmed what everyone on campus and in clubs already knew. Use was exploding among 18 to 25-year-olds. From 1978 to 1979 alone, reported use jumped 69%. Cocaine-related injuries in 1979 were up 76% over 1976.